What if skin color was never really about beauty, race, or identity? What if one of the most visible differences between human beings began as something much colder, a biological negotiation with sunlight? For thousands of years, the human body was trapped between two invisible dangers. Too much ultraviolet radiation could damage what pregnancy needed to survive. Too little of it could weaken bones, deform childhood, and make birth more dangerous. No one living through it could have understood that. They would not have seen evolution. They would have seen children who struggled to walk, pregnancies that ended without explanation, families carrying grief that seemed random, unfair, and impossible to name. This is not a story about race. It is a story about survival written on the surface of the body. And it begins with a fact that is easy to forget in the modern world. The sun was not just light. For early humans, it was pressure. For most of human prehistory, our ancestors lived under intense sunlight near the equator. The evidence strongly suggests that early human populations had dark skin, rich in melanin, the natural pigment that absorbs ultraviolet radiation before it can penetrate deeper layers of tissue. That darkness was not decorative. It was protection. In regions where sunlight was relentless, the sun could damage the body in ways that were not immediately visible. One of the most important dangers involved folate, a B vitamin that plays a critical role in reproduction and early development. Ultraviolet radiation can break down folate, and without enough folate, pregnancies can become more vulnerable. Embryos may develop incorrectly. Neural tube defects may occur. In severe cases, children may die before they ever have a chance to survive on their own. For a population living under harsh equatorial sunlight, that mattered. A small difference in skin pigmentation could mean a small difference in reproductive success. And over thousands of generations, small differences are not small anymore. They become the direction of a species. Dark skin helped protect folate. Folate helped protect pregnancy. Pregnancy kept a family line alive. No one chose it. No one understood it. No one looked at their skin and thought of vitamins, radiation, or evolutionary pressure. People simply lived. And those whose bodies were better protected from the sun were more likely to leave children behind. That is how natural selection works at its most brutal level. Not through intention, not through meaning. Through survival and death, repeated so many times that the body itself begins to change. The balance was fragile. Too little melanin under intense sunlight, and the body risked losing too much protection. Too much melanin under weak sunlight, and another problem appeared. Vitamin D. The human body needs ultraviolet radiation to produce vitamin D in the skin. And vitamin D is not a minor detail. It helps regulate calcium absorption, bone growth, immune activity, muscle function, and many processes that allow the body to develop and maintain itself. So the same sunlight that could damage folate was also needed to build bones. Human skin had to exist between those two threats. It had to block enough ultraviolet radiation to protect reproduction, and it had to allow enough ultraviolet radiation to make vitamin D. That balance depended heavily on geography. Near the equator, the danger was often too much sun. Farther north, the danger could become the opposite, not enough. Then people moved. Slowly, over thousands of years, human groups expanded into new landscapes. They followed animals, rivers, coastlines, seasons, and opportunities. They entered regions that looked nothing like the environments their ancestors had been shaped by. The sky changed. The sun sat lower in the heavens. Winters became longer. Clouds, cold, and seasonality filtered the light. In some places, ultraviolet radiation dropped sharply for large parts of the year. And suddenly, the very trait that had helped protect life in one environment could become a liability in another. Dark skin is powerful under strong sun. Under weak sunlight, it can make vitamin D harder to produce. That does not mean dark skin was useless in northern environments. Life is never that simple. Diet mattered, clothing mattered, shelter mattered, migration patterns mattered. Access to fish, animal fat, and vitamin D-rich foods could change the pressure dramatically. But for some groups, in some regions, under some conditions, reduced ultraviolet exposure may have created a serious biological problem. And unlike hunger, cold, or injury, this danger was almost impossible to see. It did not arrive like a predator. It did not look like an enemy. It lived inside the body. A person with mild vitamin D deficiency might only feel weak, tired, or unwell. But severe deficiency, especially over long periods of childhood development, can change the skeleton itself. Children may develop rickets, a condition where growing bones soften and bend. Legs can curve under the weight of the body. The chest, spine, and pelvis can be affected. Movement becomes painful or difficult. A child who should have been running with others may struggle simply to stand properly. In adults, severe deficiency can contribute to bone pain, weakness, and osteomalacia, where bones become soft and fragile. For women, skeletal deformities involving the pelvis could make childbirth more dangerous. In a world without surgery, antibiotics, blood transfusions, or modern obstetric care, a difficult birth could become fatal. The mother might die. The child might die. Sometimes both. Not every person in a low sunlight environment would have suffered this way. The reality would have depended on diet, latitude, season, culture, and chance. But when a pressure affects reproduction and child survival, even unevenly, evolution pays attention. Not consciously, relentlessly. In a small group living far from the equator thousands of years ago, none of this would have looked like biology. It would have looked like suffering. A child whose legs bent as they learned to walk. A young woman who survived childhood, but whose bones had quietly formed under stress. A pregnancy that ended in loss, leaving behind grief but no explanation. No one around them could have known that the answer was partly written in the sky. They could not measure ultraviolet radiation. They could not identify vitamin D. They could not connect skin pigmentation to sunlight chemistry. They only saw the results. Some children were weaker. Some bodies failed earlier. Some births went wrong in ways that felt random, cruel, and impossible to predict. There was no language for the cause, only the loss. And losses like that do something to a community. They do not just remove people, they leave questions behind. Imagine living in a group small enough that every death changes the shape of daily life. There are no strangers. Every child belongs to someone you know. Every illness is watched by everyone. Every failed birth is not a statistic, but a hole in the group. A child who cannot walk properly is not an abstract medical case. It is a brother, a daughter, a future hunter, a future mother, a person who needs help in a world where everyone already has too little. A mother who dies in childbirth is not a historical example. She is warmth gone from a shelter, hands gone from food gathering, a voice missing from the group. These were not people without emotion. They were people with the same basic human capacity for fear, attachment, guilt, love, and grief that we have now. They simply lived in a world with almost no margin for error. And the most painful part is that they may have blamed the wrong things. Bad luck, weak blood, spirits, curses, a mother's body, a child's body, anything except the real mechanism, because the real mechanism was invisible. Sunlight, skin, chemistry, time. Across hundreds of generations, something began to shift, not suddenly. Not in a way anyone could notice. No child was born one day and made the group say, "Now we are different." Evolution rarely announces itself. The change would have happened in small biological variations. A person born with slightly less melanin. A child whose skin allowed a little more ultraviolet radiation to pass through. A body that produced just enough more vitamin D during weak sunlight months to survive, grow, reproduce, and pass that advantage forward. Most of the time, the difference would have been subtle, barely visible. may be invisible to the people around them. But survival does not need humans to notice. It only needs outcomes. A child who walks better, a mother who survives birth, a family line that continues, a body that can function in a place where the old balance no longer works. Generation after generation, these small advantages can accumulate. Eventually, skin becomes lighter, not because light skin was better in any universal sense, only because in certain environments, under certain pressures, it may have helped solve a specific problem. The same trait that saves life in one place can endanger it in another. That is one of the most uncomfortable truths of evolution. There is no perfect human body. There are only bodies shaped by conditions that no longer ask permission before they change. The genetic evidence does not point to one simple moment when skin became lighter. It points to a slower and more complicated process. Researchers have identified several genes involved in pigmentation. Some variants associated with lighter skin became common in European populations. Others appear in East Asian populations through different genetic routes. That matters. It suggests that similar environmental pressure may have pushed different human populations towards similar outcomes, even though the exact mutations were not the same. In other words, lighter skin did not appear once and then spread everywhere in one simple wave. It seems to have emerged more than once in different places, through different biological accidents that helped address a similar problem. How to live where sunlight was weaker, seasons were darker, and vitamin D was harder to produce. That does not make the story simple. It makes it more unsettling, because it means the pressure may have been strong enough to leave similar marks on separate branches of humanity. Evolution does not care about categories humans invent later. It does not know race. It does not know beauty. It only knows whether a body survives long enough to create another body that can survive. Skin color did not change in isolation. It changed inside communities, inside families, inside the daily decisions that determined who was fed first, who was carried, who was protected, who was left behind, and who was given another chance. We cannot know exactly how every ancient group treated chronic illness, disability, or weakness. The evidence is incomplete, and human societies have always varied. Some groups cared for vulnerable members with remarkable commitment. Archaeological finds show that prehistoric people were sometimes supported through serious injury or impairment. Human compassion is not a modern invention, but survival conditions could also be severe. When food was scarce, when the group had to move, when winter was closing in, when no one had enough energy to spare, every weakness became heavier. A child with severe skeletal deformities in a migrating group was not just a medical tragedy. It was a practical crisis. A person unable to travel could slow everyone down. Someone who needed constant care could place demands on people who were already hungry, cold, and afraid. That does not mean ancient people were cruel by nature. It means they were human beings trapped in situations with no clean choices. They could love someone and still be unable to save them. They could feel guilt and still keep moving. They could remember the dead and still choose the living. That kind of grief leaves marks too, not in genes, in behavior, in stories, in how a community learns to fear weakness, value strength, and watch bodies for signs of danger. There is a psychological layer to this story that is easy to miss when we speak only in scientific terms. Genes, mutations, UV radiation, vitamin D, selection pressure. Those words are accurate, but they are also cold. They describe the mechanism without showing what it felt like to live inside it. For the people affected, this was not a lesson in biology. It was a child crying from pain in legs that should have carried them. It was a woman approaching childbirth with a body already shaped by deficiency. It was an elder watching the same kind of loss happen again and again without understanding why. It was fear passed quietly through families, a fear that some bodies were simply unlucky. some children simply fragile, some births simply doomed, and because no one could name the cause, the suffering may have felt personal. That is one of the cruelest things about invisible biological pressure. When people cannot understand the environment, they often blame the body, their own body, their child's body, the body of the person who could not survive. Long before modern science, human beings were already searching for reasons. And sometimes, in the absence of truth, grief invents an explanation. Over time, populations adapted. Not perfectly, not completely, and never in a way that erased human vulnerability. The body does not become free from danger. It only adjusts to the pressures that killed enough people before. In high ultraviolet environments, darker pigmentation helped protect against damage, including the breakdown of folate. In low ultraviolet environments, lighter pigmentation could help the body produce vitamin D more efficiently. Different places created different balances. That is why skin color varies gradually across geography rather than falling into clean, separate boxes. Human variation is not a set of hard borders. It is a map of adaptation, a gradient shaped by sunlight, migration, diet, ancestry, and time. The tragedy is that much later, societies turned that gradient into a hierarchy. They looked at a biological record of survival and treated it as evidence of worth. They took the surface of the body and built myths around it: purity, superiority, inferiority, belonging, exclusion, violence. All of it placed on top of something that began far beneath culture in the old relationship between skin and sky. That may be the most disturbing part. The feature used for centuries to divide human beings was never evidence that we were separate kinds of people. It was evidence that the same species survived different worlds. And the story is not over. Modern life has moved people faster than evolution ever could. A body shaped by ancestors who lived near the equator can now live in northern cities, under weak sun, indoors for most of the day, behind glass that blocks ultraviolet radiation. That can increase the risk of vitamin D deficiency, especially when diet and supplementation do not compensate for the lack of UV exposure. A body shaped by ancestors who lived in low sunlight regions can now live under intense equatorial sun. That can increase vulnerability to sunburn, UV damage, and certain forms of skin cancer. The old adaptations still matter, but the world around us has changed. We migrate by plane, we work indoors, we cover our skin, we alter diet, we use sunscreen, we take supplements, we live in cities where the sky may barely touch us. For the first time in human history, many people live in environments that do not match the conditions that shaped their bodies. The skin still carries an ancestral memory, but ancestry is not destiny. Medicine, knowledge, and culture can now protect people in ways evolution never could. That is the difference between the ancient world and ours. They lived under pressures they could not see. We can see many of them now. And that knowledge is not just scientific, it is moral. Because once you understand what skin color really is, the old myths become harder to defend. The color of your skin is not a simple label. It is not a measure of intelligence, value, strength, purity, or belonging. It is a record of pressure, a biological archive, a trace of sunlight passing through generations. It carries the memory of places your ancestors survived, whether those places were flooded with ultraviolet radiation or starved of it. It carries the history of bodies trying to protect pregnancies, build bones, endure winters, survive heat, and keep children alive long enough to become parents themselves. No one living through that process understood it. They did not know their bodies were changing. They did not know future societies would look at those changes and build entire systems of power around them. They only knew hunger, cold, heat, birth, death, loss, and the need to survive one more season. That is what makes the story so haunting. The most visible difference between human beings may have begun as one of the most Silent forms of suffering, not hatred, not identity, not hierarchy. A body responding to an environment that kept killing those who could not adapt. Every human being alive carries a record older than memory, not a racial category, not a measure of worth, not proof of superiority or weakness. A record of sunlight, a record of migration, a record of pregnancies that survived, children who did not, bodies that adapted without knowing what they were adapting to. The color of your skin is not just inheritance. It is evidence that your ancestors lived somewhere, the world placed pressure on them, and that enough of them survived for you to exist. We have spent centuries turning that difference into a weapon, into a border, into a myth. But beneath the violence, the arrogance, and the fear, the biological origin is far more human. Skin color is not proof that we are separate. It is proof that the same fragile species kept finding ways to stay alive under different skies. And every time we forget that, we stop seeing skin for what it really is. Not a wall between people, a scar left by survival.